Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very special webinar on COVID-19 and the prospects for sustainable development. This webinar is hosted by the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability at Monash Business School. Today, we're proud to present internationally renowned development economist, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, joined by Monash University's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Margaret Gardner AC, in this very special webinar event, which has a vast international audience, and I hope many of our Monash students are joining us today. The webinar is part of an ongoing series we're hosting, COVID-19 and Beyond. It's intended to provide a forum for discussion on the huge economic impact and social ramifications of the pandemic and the priorities for the evolving policy responses, both in developing and the developed countries. Professor Sachs' address will be followed by a Q&A session. You're welcome to submit anytime your questions through the Q&A functionality on Zoom. The questions will be moderated, so we might not get to yours. That's just an indication of the time constraints, not the lack of interest. So at this stage, I'd like to hand it over to Professor and Vice-Chancellor and President of Monash University, Margaret Gardner, to introduce the speaker, Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you, Professor Wilkie. We're extremely fortunate to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs with us for this special webinar event, and it gives me really great pleasure to introduce him to you today. Professor Sachs is University Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He's also Director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and a Commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. Professor Sachs has been advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General and currently serves as the Sustainable Development Goals Advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He spent more than 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he received his BA, MA and PhD degrees. He's also, as many of you will know, an author of numerous bestseller books, most recently The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology and Institutions this year. Professor Sachs has been twice named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists, which is always the better category to be in. Pleased to welcome Professor Sachs once again to Monash University. I have very fond memories of his wonderful Richard Larkins oration. And so I look forward to this, and we look forward to his review of global experiences and roadmaps to recovery. Professor Sachs will discuss what lessons can be drawn from different experiences of countries so far in terms of what a recovery will look like and what role the United Nations and global financial institutions will play. And in fact, where will Australia be placed? And I'm so delighted to welcome Professor Sachs. Thank you.
President Gardner, thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to be with you, wonderful to be with Monash, but I do wish it were in person. That was the plan, and we'll keep to that plan, I hope, sometime as soon as possible. I was planning to spend some time this summer at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute with John Thwaites and all of the wonderful colleagues there, and to see you. And we will still fulfill that as soon as travel resumes. In the meantime, I'm very happy to be with you to compare notes and experiences of this pandemic. I think it's certainly the case that we're all living through something that was really not imaginable just a few months ago. And we're living through an eruption or disruption of the world at a scale that none of us has experienced in our lives. This is a big event, and it's still in its early phase, and it is already earth-shaking, not only in the direct effects of the virus, but in many, many other implications. my country, the United States, the cities are burning again tonight, as they have been in recent days. This is not literally due to the pandemic, but it is due to a very serious crisis of governance that the US is going through right now. And definitely the pandemic has made it more dramatic, exacerbated the tensions, made the US less governable. And we've sensed for weeks and weeks that we were facing huge shocks in the US. And I think things are becoming more and more dangerous and unstable. So I would like to give a brief overview of the pandemic as I understand it. I've been, like I think all of us probably, thinking about it round the clock every day for many, many weeks to try to make sense of what's happening and also to think about the way out of this crisis. And I'll share some thoughts with you on that. I think the most basic point to understand is that the world is experiencing this pandemic in extraordinarily different ways. The ability of different countries or societies or regions to suppress the epidemic vary tremendously. We're trying to understand why that is, but it is a fair summary to say that Australia and New Zealand, together with East Asia, is the part of the world that has been most successful, not in ending the crisis by any means, but in limiting the crisis dramatically, keeping deaths down, and largely suppressing the epidemic. That means stopping the exponential growth of this epidemic well before it would happen naturally in the course of a runaway epidemic occurrence. On the other side, Western Europe and the United States have had a completely disastrous period with massive deaths, rapid spread of the infection, and it's far from over in the United States and no doubt in parts of Europe as well. So there's a huge difference of experience of the Asia-Pacific region and the North Atlantic region. And I would say a difference that would not easily have been predicted at the start. And indeed, there were various studies and indexes of emergency preparedness that were quite popular and cited. And the United States, ridiculously in retrospect, was #1 on the list of preparedness. So we were supposed to be the country that knew how to contain an epidemic like this, but it's been a complete collapse and ways of society more generally. The situation is fraught in the rest of the world that I have not mentioned yet, mainly the developing world, in Latin America, in Africa, in South Asia, in Central Asia. The epidemic is still at an early stage, and it is very hard to know what the path is going to be. It's neither decisively under control, as in the Asia Pacific, nor is it so evidently out of control as in North America and Europe, except for some completely alarming instances, the most notable of which is Brazil, where a Trump-like president, Bolsonaro, is governing in a Trump-like epidemic, where in Brazil the epidemic is running out of control, basically the way that it has run out of control in the United States. In other parts of Latin America, the situation is grim. And in much of the rest of the developing world, Africa, South Asia, including Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, hugely populous countries with a combined population of about 1.8 billion people. We don't know whether this can still possibly be contained or whether we're going to have a rampant epidemic. So first order of business is to understand these differences and to understand what works in suppressing the epidemic, why some places, as notable as the United States, France, Italy, Spain, and to some extent Germany, have failed relative to the Asia Pacific, to understand what is still possible in the developing countries in terms of control. And then I want to say some words about how the economic side of this will unfold. I start with the public health epidemic side because I don't think we can speak of the economy without first understanding the dynamics of the epidemic itself. It is a kind of maintained hypothesis of mine that unless the epidemic is contained, there can't really be an economic recovery that is robust. So I view public health as basic macroeconomics right now. Contain the virus, you have a chance to save the economy. Have the virus continue to run out of control, the economy from a macroeconomic point of view will be in a state of outright disarray and indeed collapse. So I put the emphasis first on the epidemic itself. So let me say a few words about what we know about the dynamics of the epidemic, the basic epidemiology of this disease. COVID-19 is, as everybody knows, a new coronavirus, and it's one where there is apparently no or little innate or acquired immunity. I think it is safe to assume the worst, that everybody is susceptible or was susceptible at the start of this epidemic. And the epidemic has so far reached still only a small proportion of the world population. The official number of confirmed cases, that is by test, is somewhere around 4 million. But we could assume that the actual number of infections may be 10 to 50 times that. It could be, say, 40 to 100 million. But in a population of 7.8 billion, it means that only a very, very small proportion of the world has been infected to this point, maybe 1%, maybe 2% of the world, probably not. And that means that this epidemic is still in a very, very dangerous and early phase. So the first point is that almost a universal susceptibility at the start. I think the second point is that this is very transmissible. The transmission interval, or the generation interval, as the epidemiologists call it, from an infection to the next infection seems to average just a few days, maybe 6 days is the generation interval. The so-called basic reproduction rate, how many people are infected by each infectious individual at the start of this process before any acquired immunity develops, is estimated generally as between 2 and 3 people infected per infectious case. And when you combine that basic reproduction rate, often put it around 2.4, with a generation interval of about 6.5 days, that suggests a doubling time of between 3 and 4 days in an uncontrolled epidemic. In other words, this epidemic, if left out of control, doubles maybe twice in a week. And that means maybe 8 doublings in a month. That is 2 to the 8th power. That is 256 times, if I've got it right, in a month. And that means that things could look completely under control at the start of the month and be completely out of control by the end of the month. And that's exactly what has happened in the United States and in Western Europe. And I'll give you a few rather shocking anecdotes of that. So this is the second factor which makes this epidemic so extraordinary. A third is that there is almost surely a pre-symptomatic period of infectiousness, meaning that probably about a day where people are still pre-symptomatic and yet are infective or infectious to others. That's nasty because it means people can be walking around not knowing that they are sick, but transmitting the virus. It's probably roughly the case that the high infectious period is about a week, and 1 day of that week roughly is a pre-symptomatic infectious period, and roughly 6 days are symptomatic and infectious. This is a hard disease to control. There are many mild cases that transmit the disease to others. There are asymptomatic, or I should say pre-symptomatic cases that transmit the virus to others. That makes it truly treacherous. When it was SARS, for example, people got very, very sick but before they became infectious. So SARS was much easier to control than COVID-19 because of this difference of transmissibility in a pre-symptomatic stage. And the fourth point that I would mention about this epidemic is that the infection fatality rate, though it is age specific and location specific and depends on many, many factors such as prevalence of comorbidities like diabetes or high blood pressure or obesity or other factors, we're pretty sure that the infection fatality rate is somewhere around 1%, maybe a little bit lower, but probably 10 times higher than a serious influenza. So this is pretty deadly. And what we're also learning is that many non-fatal infections are really debilitating. Not only are they very harsh episodes of disease, but they seem now to be leaving longer-term consequences. We don't have enough experience to know what the true long-term is, so there's a lot of uncertainty. But it is not a quick bounce back after a few days in many, many cases. If you add all of this up, the almost universal susceptibility, the rapid transmission, the stealthy transmission, and the high infection fatality rate, this is one hell of a illness. And that's why it is so dramatically upended the world. There have been many theories. Oh, it's not so bad. It's like a flu. Just let it go. It'll pass. It's a bad flu season. I think these are deeply discredited by the actual events. This is not a disease that one can just leave to run its course. And incidentally, with a basic reproduction number of around 2.4, the implication of just running its course is that more than 80% of the population in a randomly mixed population with an R0 of 2.4 would be infected in the end. The so-called attack rate of this virus would be more than 80% of the population. And that is just devastating. If you think about the United States, 80% of our 330 million population would be about 270 million people, and a 1% infection fatality rate would be horrible. 2.7 million people dead in an uncontrolled pandemic, a true, utter, shocking disaster, not to mention the 270 million people that would go through an episode of illness. So this is not a disease that one can just allow to run its course, because the consequences would be devastating. Now, start the clock sometime in late 2019. The infection began, of course, in Hubei province, or we think it did. Maybe it began actually someplace else in Western China, but it came to Hubei province and to Wuhan clearly by mid-December, and started to identify, and the Wuhan doctors started to see a cluster of cases by around December 20th. By the end of December, WHO was notified on December 31st. As of January 11, the new virus had been identified and its genome posted online. On January 20th, a very senior epidemiologist in China, a famous pulmonologist, actually declared that there was human-to-human transmission. And on the 23rd of January, Wuhan was locked down, and then Hubei province, and then all of China. China went into very high alert. And on January 31st, the virus was declared a public health emergency of international significance by WHO. I want to say a couple of things about this. First, my reading of it is that China went very fast and acted very very quickly, and on the whole, quite transparently. This is quite different from the narrative of the US and sometimes the Australian government by suggestion that China covered up and hid things. There's also a theory pushed by the American right wing that this virus was released from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which I'm told by many virologists is just simply not possible, given what was under investigation in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I think it's overwhelmingly likely that this was a natural zoonotic event, probably from a mammalian intermediate host that gave it to a human. Maybe that human was, we don't know where, but maybe delivering goods to the Wuhan wet market, because that's where a significant early part of the outbreak occurred. But it seems to me overwhelmingly likely that this was a natural occurrence. And in the fog of war, from the early detection of unusual pneumonias around Christmas time of 2019 to the posting of the genome on January 11, that's very, very fast. And Wuhan authorities notified WHO on December 31st, and many countries in the neighborhood who were very aware of what SARS had done and maybe very suspicious of what the heck was going on, took emergency action from the very start. And one notable case of that is Taiwan, which from December 31st said, we are closing up travel with mainland China. We want to send experts to Wuhan. Something very dangerous is going on. And it shows that if one was paying attention, and the countries in the region were paying much more attention than the US and Europe, it was pretty clear by early January that something very unusual was underway and that precaution should be taken. Incidentally, though everything is secret in the US government, it's pretty clear that the national intelligence agencies briefed Trump repeatedly in early January. It's also known that the Chinese CDC director called the US Centers for Disease Control director on January 3rd, and the head of the US CDC, Dr. Redfield, called his boss, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who briefed the president. We have a president who does not listen to anybody but himself, and it's clear that he ignored everything that he was told about this virus, basically, not just through January, but until mid-March. But I go through the chronology to emphasize that certainly by January 23rd, when China locked down Hubei province, this was a global emergency. And then the question is what to do. And properly, the thing to do is to stop arrivals of this virus from China. So to screen incoming passengers or stop incoming travel, and to dramatically scale up the capacity to identify potential cases of community transmission. That means that a case has arrived from China and transmitted, and then starting transmitting within the country itself, not just arrivals from outside. As a general proposition, it is right to say that the Asia Pacific was on the case a lot faster than Europe and the US. And I think that this is the basic reason why the situation is vastly, vastly better in the Asia Pacific than what has turned out to be the case in Europe and the United States. Countries that had experience with SARS, with H1N1, with the Nipah virus in 2014, 2015, with MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, were on alert. And also, maybe the caseload of incoming travel to Australia and New Zealand was fortunately not so heavy in the early days, so that the seeding of the infection was not extreme. Actually, what happened in the US, just to mention, is that it seems, according to forensic reconstruction of the virus, that our infections on the East Coast of the United States actually didn't come from China in the end, they came from Europe. So the virus went from China to Europe, especially Italy, and then from Europe to the United States. While we were watching maybe some arrivals from Asia, we weren't watching arrivals from Europe, even though the virus was spreading. Once community transmission takes place, then there are two possible courses of action, or well, there's three. One is let it rip, but as I indicated, the outcome is absolutely horrendous if you just let the epidemic proceed. So every country in the end does something. And the two things to do, one is to scale up public health measures, especially trying to identify infected people as early as possible and isolate them as early as possible. And the main way to do that is to test cases and to trace the contacts of COVID positive cases. So-called testing, tracing, and isolating public health strategy. The other thing to do is to try to limit the spread of the infection by wearing face masks, physical distancing, monitoring of people and their symptoms in public. The third thing to do is a lockdown or shutdown. And so keep in mind two main public health strategies, testing, tracing, and isolating, and physical distancing and hygiene, especially face masks, thermal monitoring, and so forth, and physical spacing in public areas. And then the other approach is the lockdown approach. The lockdown approach, the public health approach, if it works, is by far the most efficient because you lock down just a very small proportion of the population, the infected people. So if we magically knew all who were infected, all we'd have to do was keep them isolated for 7 or 14 days, and the epidemic would go away, assuming that you're also blocking new arrivals. Amazingly efficient. A small group of people are identified, are isolated, kept from general circulation, and the epidemic goes away. In fact, you don't have to have 100% success rate in that. The name of the game is to stop the number of infections from being greater than 1 from each infected person. So we want what's called the effective reproduction rate to be less than 1. That doesn't mean that you stop every infection. It just means that on average, you prevent an infected person from infecting more than one other person. And that can be done by testing and isolating and tracing many of the contacts, not all of them. So public health, and by enforcing face masks in public so that any contact between an infectious person and a susceptible person is less likely to transmit the disease. By and large, this has been the East Asian approach. Keep people away from China, monitor incoming arrivals, later on quarantining them, and then using testing, tracing, and isolating, as well as physical distancing to keep the effective reproduction rate less than 1. Australia has done it, New Zealand has done it, Taiwan has done it, Hong Kong has done it, Japan has done it, Korea, I think I said, and China did it after the first complete blowout in Wuhan. But it did get this under control. And epidemiologists use the data to calculate the effective reproduction rate by day. And you can ask, are we under 1 or are we greater than 1? And Australia is consistently less than 1 in recent weeks. And this means that the great numbers of infected are going down over time. And the deaths in Australia are 103 notified COVID-19 deaths in total for Australia's population of 25 million. In the US, we have 107,000 deaths. So 1,000 times the number of deaths of Australia, but our population is about 13 times larger. But we have 1,000 times more deaths. So you can see what a chaos we have. So let me turn to the US just to explain the US situation quickly for you. There's one basic explanation for everything happening in the US, and that is Trump. We have the worst president in American history. He is a narcissist and a psychopath, I'm sorry to say. And we are suffering multiple deep crises because of this. No matter how deep the crisis so far, he maintains his base of support of roughly 40% of the population. It's uncanny. We now have nearly 20% unemployment. We have 100,000 people dead. We now have fires burning in dozens of cities around the country because of violent protests against the police, brutality towards African Americans. We have everything going on in the US, and the country remains totally divided, roughly 42% in today's weighted approval rating versus 53% against. I don't understand it exactly, I have to tell you, because to my mind, we've never had worse leadership in the history of our country. But this is what we have. What Trump did with the epidemic was precisely, not precisely nothing, almost nothing. At the end of January, when cases were circulating, we did not have testing yet. Our Centers for Disease Control made faulty test kits, which it sent around the country, which didn't work. But no other test kits replaced them until March. We didn't have protective equipment. And the head of our Centers for Disease Control, who was an incompetent person appointed by an incompetent president, declared as late as early March, this is not dangerous for the American people. They did not understand how much virus was transmitting. They didn't understand how little they were measuring. They did not understand the geometric progression of an uncontrolled outbreak. And until today, literally until today, and I can hardly explain it, we still don't have a public health regimen in the United States to test, isolate, and trace contacts. And much of the country is in rebellion against the idea of face masks and physical spacing. And we have a ridiculous debate in the United States that says, don't shut down the economy. We need the economy. And so if people die, they're just going to die. But with the fallacy of the false alternative, not understanding that public health measures are the right way to proceed. And that's how you can lift an economic shutdown, by having something to replace it. And so we've had a debate of economy versus shutdown for 2 months now, with almost not a word at the federal level about public health measures, about quarantining, about identifying and isolating infectious individuals. And the president has repeatedly refused to advocate wearing face masks in public. So we have a very unruly public. We have a very unruly president, a very mentally unstable man. And the result is now 106,000 deaths and continued transmission of the disease. And in recent days, after the murder of an African American by a policeman in Minneapolis, we have large-scale demonstrations and some violent rioting in American cities, and these will be super spreader events where we're going to see huge jumps of infection rates because of the mass crowds that have been out on the streets in recent days. We also are lifting the shutdowns at this stage also in many states. And all of it is to say the epidemic is not at all under control in the US. In Latin America, 2 big countries follow the US lead. One is Brazil, where the president is a populist like Trump, similarly anti-science and incompetent, Jair Bolsonaro. And Brazil is in a full-fledged epidemic now with tens of thousands of deaths, and it's getting worse and worse. Mexico is similar in that there's also a populist president, and Mexico is seeing a spiraling epidemic as well. Many, many other parts of the Americas are really out of control. Peru and Ecuador, probably Central America, probably Haiti. The estimates show the basic reproduction number well above 1. Finally, just to continue the quick tour of the world, the infections came much later to Africa, mainly through Europe, and also to South Asia. There's just not as much intensive interconnection with China or with Europe. So the seeding of the infection was lower, but these countries saw the chaos of Western Europe, Italy, Spain, France, and then the United States. And so by mid-March, even with a few confirmed cases, they generally locked down or shut down the economy around the same time that Australia did, but with few cases. And so there is at least the potential that this is somewhat under control. But the evidence is not encouraging, because if one watches day by day, it does seem that the outbreaks are spreading now in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, probably in Indonesia, probably in South Africa, probably in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Congo, Kinshasa, and others. So I'm very worried that we are not really containing the epidemic, but we're seeing what starts out small, but remember this is geometric process, what grows very, very fast is the potential for very widespread outbreaks in very poor countries. These countries cannot shut down very effectively. People don't have the means to subsist day by day without daily income. People literally live hand to mouth. They have to work each day, so shutdowns are very difficult. On the other hand, without a shutdown, public health becomes the only stopgap to be able to identify, test, trace, isolate infectious people, and to enforce physical distancing. This is very hard in these countries. Also, capacity for testing is very low. These are also places where there's so much informality, migration between cities and the countryside, few doctors, of course, very low hospital capacity. So this is a very dangerous situation that we're in. And I'm not very optimistic, I have to say, for the moment, though it's not out of control yet, it's also not in control. So let me turn to the economic implications of this. If this disease were ideally managed, the epidemic would be over in a couple of months, and we would get back to something like normal, something like a V-shaped recovery. And the Asia Pacific is closest to this, though even in the Asia Pacific, it's not going to be quite a V-shaped recovery. It's going to be a much more gradual recovery. But the Asia Pacific, about 2 billion people, and I'm speaking of Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, and Korea, and the ASEAN countries with the possible exception of Indonesia, are close to having this epidemic under control. And if Indonesia is able to suppress the epidemic, that would really mean that ASEAN +3 +2, or what is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership region, the RCEP region of 15 countries, would be the first place in the world to stop the virus and to be able to open up trade. In that situation, there would be some return to near normalcy of daily life and economics. Not fully. There will be some changes of the economy. We're going to be Zooming and webinars and less travel for sure. We're going to be working from home more than before. We're going to be engaged in e-commerce more than before. This will mean loss of jobs that will stick for office workers, for real estate, for new building construction, for commuting and transport, for some retail shops, which will turn to e-commerce. I think there will be persisting change, some much for the good, I believe, but by and large, it would be possible with the optimum public health policies to bounce back from this. But that's probably not what's going to happen, because we're not in a world of optimum public health policies. We're in a world of Trumps and Bolsonaros. And in the United States, for example, we are approaching depression level conditions. Our headline unemployment rate is 15%, but our actual unemployment rate is probably well over 20%. And for the Americas as a whole, there's an open economic collapse underway. And in many other places, we're not going to get that quick bounce back because we're not getting the quick suppression of the epidemic. So the longer this epidemic goes on, the deeper is the economic crisis. The deeper is the economic crisis, the greater is the economic suffering. The more there is unemployment, the more there are bankruptcies and debts that go into default, people who can't pay their rents, foreclosures, and so on. And this turns from an epidemic crisis to a prolonged balance sheet crisis, a debt crisis, a long-term unemployment crisis. I believe this is what's happening in the United States, and that we are in this now for a long, deep slog, thanks to Mr. Trump and his vulgarities and incompetence. I just don't see a quick bounce back. And for a lot of the world, I fear that this is really what is likely to happen now. And in some places, a huge humanitarian crisis, because people will be hungry, either because they're locked down and can't eat, they've lost their income, they're unemployed and there's no social benefits, there are disruptions of supply chains, many things could happen. But I fear the potential for some very significant humanitarian crises. And if we have more deep climate shocks, as we tend to have every year, this will exacerbate things. And one region to watch, for example, is the Horn of Africa and East Africa, which is facing an unprecedented locust attack on top of the COVID epidemic attack and the economic effects. And remember that the developing countries are losing remittance income, tourist income, and terms of trade deterioration, where commodities prices have declined, especially for the oil exporting or coal exporting countries, because the prices are way down. So I see the crisis not only as not in control from an epidemiological or public health point of view, but also not in control from an economic point of view, not a V-shaped recovery, but turning into a prolonged crisis. Finally, let me turn to the way out. The way out starts with suppressing the epidemic itself. So I see no way out unless we stop the transmission of the virus. But as I've indicated, that's feasible. And you're doing it in Australia and in New Zealand and in other countries of East Asia. So this is a virus that should be stopped through intensive and scaled up public health means. And shutdowns should be used at the beginning to help stop the rampant exponential growth of the epidemic, to reduce cases to within a range that can be handled by the public health system. But then the public health system should take over. Once that happens, we need cooperation. We need to start trade again, movement of goods, movement of people, tourism, and so on. And so global cooperation is extraordinarily important, and regional cooperation is extraordinarily important. I am of the view that the Asia-Pacific region should start first to be the first region to get out of the crisis. Not only the so-called bubble of Australia and New Zealand, but actually ASEAN plus China plus Japan plus Korea plus Australia and New Zealand. The RCEP region should be the first to recover, because you're almost there. I think the main point is to contain the epidemic in Indonesia, to make sure that Indonesia, which is a vast country after all, does not have a vast epidemic, which then threatens and spills over to the rest of the region. And I think Australia can play a very important role together with China, Japan, Korea. I'm a very big believer in the need for global cooperation in order to accomplish these goals. And that's why I'm also aghast at the behavior of the United States in trying to turn this into a new Cold War with China. I do not believe that China is guilty in these circumstances. If it made mistakes in the fog of the battle of a new virus, I believe, although of course we'll find out more over time. I don't think it's wise for Australia to play its normal foreign policy role of mimicking the United States. I do think it's important to understand that we do not have a normal government in the United States. So if you follow the US lead, this will hurt Australia, I'm sorry to say. Mr. Pompeo is a liar, and Trump is a psychopath. And I'm just using words advisedly for my dear friends in Australia. This is not a US government to be trusted, unfortunately. It is really a rogue government, but Australia is a close ally and therefore tends to follow the foreign policy line of the United States as a matter of security. But this is not security. Security for Australia right now is regional cooperation that is strong, including China, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN countries. And I think this would be a wonderful thing for the RCEP region to lead the world recovery because it has led most effectively in the containment of the epidemic itself. Well, we need to do the same everywhere. I don't think the epidemic in the United States is going to be contained while Trump is president. So I'm hoping in November we have a newly elected president and that we have a chance to stop this. Otherwise, I feel that we'll have continued outbreaks for months and indeed possibly years to come. And we will have tensions galore, whether it's the social tensions, the economic tensions of depression, or the geopolitical tensions which Trump and his nationalist allies want to stoke with China and with others. How to recover, finally, if the virus is contained, part of the economy will go back to normal, but not all of it. And there will need to be a kind of, not stimulus, but I would say investment-led recovery. And here I'll just put in my hope for a sustainable development-based recovery. There is a lot of talk about green recovery, building back in a sustainable way. Europe is featuring the European Green Deal. That's very good. Korea has recently adopted a Korean Green Deal. That is very important. I urge strongly that China should green the Belton Road Initiative. I believe the Belton Road Initiative could be an important direction for recovery because it is investment-led modern infrastructure, but it must be green infrastructure, renewable energy, electrification of vehicles, and so forth, 5G, and so on. So I would like to see the RCEP region work on a Green Deal for the 15 RCEP countries as part of the recovery. This always raises the challenge for Australia, which is a major coal exporting country, to get on the case, to export hydrogen and store geologically the CO2 that results in the hydrogen production from your coal, to tap your vast solar energy, where Australia is, again, a solar superpower, which could be exported through submarine cable to Southeast Asia. So I think that if RCEP cooperates, you have all the makings of a green recovery that could then partner with other regions of the world as they suppress the epidemic and go for investment-led growth. And we could turn this tragedy and calamity into a new trajectory of sustainable development that builds safer, more resilient, more sustainable economies as the way to reconstruct our high employment and to redesign the direction of economic growth. Let me stop there. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. That was, sobering and thought-provoking, and rightly so, in this time of very significant disruption, and indeed some destruction, in which you talk about the possibilities for a reconstruction. We've got some questions, and I'm going to perhaps begin by asking just to take you to this question of the road to recovery. So you have made the centrepiece of your road to recovery, apart from it being a Green Deal, being globally cooperative and heavily dependent on trade and, open borders, which has been, frankly, traditionally the economic view about how you build strength. I wondered if you could perhaps talk to us about what you think in a situation where there is likely to be ongoing mobility, international mobility restrictions. What is the role of domestic economic policy in this relative to what has been, for countries such as Australia in particular, a very trade-based view of how they proceed? So the small open economies in a world of restriction is interesting to me.
Yeah, there is a lot of talk about whether COVID means the end of globalization, whether it means shorter supply chains that are less disrupted by these kinds of events. And geopolitically, the United States is trying to break supply chains with China. So there's a deliberate attempt by the United States to not contain the virus, which I wish they were doing, but to contain China. So they have the wrong message and the wrong strategy, in my view. Well, when you study economics and you study economic history I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm sorry to say it, but almost 50 years now in my case, you cannot turn your back on international trade. It is just so fundamental as part of success of economic life. And Adam Smith pointed it out in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations that trade allows for specialization and it allows for comparative advantage. It allows for a larger market to give incentive for innovation. It binds our fates more together so that we are more peaceful together and understand our commonality of fate. So I have preached open trade for all my career, from starting 40 years ago as an assistant professor at Harvard, and I'm not going to change tonight or tomorrow morning or your morning time. I believe in globalization and I believe in trade, and I believe in trying to contain the negative sides of globalization, which are undoubted, including the spread of pathogens, by focused efforts, not to stop the benefits of globalization, but to stop the pathogens. So I would like us to keep open, keep good relations with neighbors, keep the benefits of trade, which certainly have helped Australia in its history and in modern times as well, and would not like to see that lost. And Australia has a great many things to export and a great many things that it benefits from importing. And as an autarkic economy, which Australia has tried from time to time, it's never worked out too well for Australia to go autarkic. It is absolutely the mindset of US nationalists now to press for breaking the links with China. And this is out of the US playbook of trying to break the Soviet Union through economic containment from 1947 to 1991. And since that episode was, quote, successful in the US view, they're really trying it again. And there was a mini skirmish with Japan in the 1980s when Japan was getting too successful in exporting semiconductors. So the US also, and automobiles, so the US also imposed protectionism at that case to try to break the Japanese progress as well. This is the mindset in the US right now. And part of that mindset is let's destroy Huawei, for example, which is China's successful 5G producer. And they're doing it through extraordinary means, trying to stop now every export of semiconductors, advanced semiconductors to Huawei. I find this profoundly regrettable. And again, because Australia is so naturally following the US line, there's a lot of, and because Rupert Murdoch is our common fate, unfortunately, both the media and the politics are often shared. And I just bemoan all of this idea that we should try to, quote, contain 20% of the world population, Australia's largest market, and a country that I do not view, by the way, as an aggressor compared to my own country, the United States. We're very good at starting wars. We've started many of them. China, fortunately, none in the last 40 years. And we should take that to heart, that we could have peaceful relations and good, open trading relations. So there are areas, where I don't mind a touch of nationalism and bringing back some supply chains and so on, but I would not try to make a habit of protectionism or try to see the end of globalization.
Could I perhaps, Flavio Menezes has got a follow-on question, if you like, from this question of comparative advantage. And he's asked, in essence, but will new comparative advantages emerge? Because, this reshaping that you alluded to in your speech, could you perhaps just address that? Because there's how we once understood international trade. Do we need to understand it in exactly the same way?
Well, one thing for sure is the classic international trade was based on natural factor endowments. So all the reasons why a land-rich country should export staple grain, for example, or a coal-rich country should export coal. And Heckscher and Olean, who invented modern trade theory about 120 years ago, emphasized the physical endowments as the basis. And there's still truth to that. It's the big countries like Australia, the United States, Canada, Brazil, which export agricultural products. And it's the densely populated countries of Northeast Asia which import agricultural products. So that is Heckscher-Olean-based trade, land-labor ratios. But most of the world economy is now based on ideas and technology. And that makes for very different endogenous technological change, and it makes for different kinds of trade, much more intra-industry trade based on product specialization and technological innovation. Australia, being one of the most sophisticated societies in the world and high education, has all the capacity to be an exporter of high technology services and industry. And this certainly should be a major focus. And I do believe that the digital age is one of the two defining elements of our age, other than what we're talking about in geopolitics or epidemics. The other defining aspect of our age is the environmental crisis. So trade has to be shaped by two basic things: the new digital world and the ecological crisis. And that strikes me that it means that we're looking for smart technologies built on 5G, 6G, artificial intelligence, computing systems, and renewable energy. Fortunately, electrification with sunshine and lots of smart systems combined will define a lot of the new economy. And one of the things that's happening, indeed, and the epidemic is accelerating it, is we are moving even faster to the digital economy now, because the epidemic is pushing work from home. We all work online now. And it's, by the way, you don't want to make everything out of it, but it's got a lot of pleasant side to it. And not that I love the epidemic, quite the contrary, but people are saving an hour of commuting each way, or an hour and a half of commuting into New York, and working perfectly productively online. And so I think that these are going to stick, these changes. And there are reasons to believe that e-commerce is a lot more efficient than brick and mortar commerce for a lot of kinds of things. And there are reasons to believe that e-governance, e-education, e-health, all are big contributors. So I think the structural change in the economy will persist. There will be hysteresis from all of this, because people will say, oh my God, we can do this from home. And I used to be traveling every day up until the beginning of March. And I'd often say, couldn't we do it by Skype? And they, no, we really need you there in person. Oh, could I do it by Skype or Zoom? No. But now that will change also, because etiquette will also allow for more connections in a perfectly normal way. So I think we're in for technological change around the digital revolution. And I am a believer that it could lead, if done properly, to more leisure time, less heavy commuting time, a cleaner environment. There are a lot of things to work out, and suddenly being thrown into this as the only thing by an epidemic is not the best case for it. But I do think a lot of these changes will stick. A lot of big businesses are, of course, saying we're not going back to the 5-day work week in the office. Maybe people will come in 1 or 2 days, and 3 days they'll do it from home. So we'll have a lot more flexibility in design. All of this is to say, when Australia thinks about its development strategy, it should be in the lead of the digital age. It should be in the lead of the renewable economy. Australia is such a wonderful place to be. Also, people will come to visit and enjoy the tourism and the uniqueness. And thanks God, counting on Australia to protect the Great Barrier Reef and your wonderful ecosystem, so that that doesn't get destroyed through the short-sightedness that we're perfectly capable of right now. But I think that these structural changes are, on the whole, potentially very positive. I'll add one more obvious thought, which is, as we move to the digital age, the distributional implications for society are very, very big and very complicated, actually. And the first bit in the US right now is that 20 million jobs have been destroyed, almost all of them basic skill jobs, not requiring a college education, in the retail sector and in the entertainment and accommodations and restaurant sector, being replaced by, and in the temporary office support sector. And the income implications of this are highly adverse. So it's people with advanced degrees that work from home and keep their jobs, and it's people with lower wages, less educational requirements for work that are losing their jobs in huge numbers. And the biggest gainer in our economy, without question, is Jeffrey Bezos, whose wealth has gone up by about $30 billion in this pandemic, because Amazon has, gobbled up another huge chunk of the retail sector. So one dystopic vision of what I'm talking about is that Mr. Bezos owns everything and all the rest of us have no work left. And that would be a disastrous outcome, not impossible. What we need to do is to combine digitalization with more leisure time, with shared benefits, with Amazon paying some taxes, in fact, quite a lot of taxes, Mr. Bezos paying a lot of taxes, and making sure that we end up with a fair distribution of income and a 3.5-day work week rather than mass unemployment.
So I'm going to say that we're probably reaching a time where I'll ask you just one last question, and thank you for that reflection at the end of the last one on the distributional inequalities, which raises a huge set of public policy, economic policy questions that have perhaps not had the prominence they should have in discussions about in discussions of macroeconomic policy, actually, and you've raised something that's quite important. But of course, there's distributional inequality within a nation, and so the impact of this economic change. Are there differences in the path to recovery or the likely outcomes for developing as opposed to developed economies? Becoming perhaps a less clear line, but perhaps you could reflect on that.
There are a lot of poor countries that are in dire, dire crisis right now. First, countries that may not be able to contain the epidemic. And so take extreme poverty plus an epidemic, you get misery, hunger, death, despair, unrest. This is absolutely possible. In fact, it's hard to see how it's going to be avoided the way we're going right now, because there will be poor countries that suffer disasters. There certainly are middle-income countries in that situation now, and if you think about the favelas of Brazil, or the slums of Lima, or the crisis in Quito, it's very serious. But Africa, because this started later, we haven't seen that in full force, but it's almost surely going to hit some part of Africa very, very badly. So that's a pure out and out humanitarian disaster. And then the question comes, can our system handle it? And our systems are very weak. And one part, of course, of the weakness is that the United States is no longer part of constructive engagement in the world. Maybe that will change after November, but under Trump, he's the one that pulled the US out of WHO as a ploy to point the finger at China. And this is both disgusting and dangerous at the same time. So I'm in touch daily with the IMF and with the WHO and with others about the humanitarian systems design and whether we can get the urgent financial help to poor countries. We have to be worried, frankly. The people in charge of the international organizations are doing a wonderful job, but they don't have the strong backing of the political leaders in the world that they need. So this is one thing that's going to happen. And the longer we go on with this stretched out containment phase, the worse it's going to be for developing countries who will lose remittance income, foreign exchange earnings from tourism, As I said, declining terms of trade. So this could yet turn into a depression level crisis. And I don't see a way out of that unless we stop the epidemic itself. And that's why I come back to the beginning point, and I'll close there. The real economics of the greatest urgency right now is public health itself. Stop the epidemic by all means, and especially the public health means. And then we're going to have hard work to do on the economics, but it will be so much easier if the epidemic isn't going, and nearly impossible if the epidemic is proceeding at its exponential rate.
Can I say, I'd like to hand over to Professor Simon Wilkie, the Dean, to perhaps close, but can I say myself, on behalf of participants too, my personal great thanks for a very thought-provoking address and answers to questions, which there are many more than could be dealt with here in the time. And to say that I appreciate the message of the opportunities for a Green Deal, for greater global cooperation, for learning and rethinking our policy responses as an opportunity for us, along with the clear outline of what happens if we don't seize those opportunities. So could I hand over to Professor Simon Wilkie?
Thanks, Margaret. So I'm just going to amplify our Vice-Chancellor and President's comments. The note you left us on, Jeff, I think is actually important for the future of the university, because it shows the role that we have forward in linking these big issues together. This is really a moment for us to rethink national strategy. What do we want to be as we emerge from this? And what's the better role we can play in our part of the world to be a better partner and a more proactive designer of the future? Because, you know, this is not free market anarchy. This is something where it's going to require, literally, to use a term, intelligent design. And that's really, I think, transparent from your comments today. So on behalf of the Business School, on behalf of Monash University, I'd like to thank you for your time. This has been a very enlightening and provocative talk. And I'd just like to give a shout out to Asad Islam and his team and everybody, and Hannah and everybody who helped put this together. I think this was a great and informative exercise, and we hope to do it again soon. Cheers, everybody.
And let me say, you know, it's such a pleasure and honor to be associated with Monash and to work together with you. And it's such a great university and exciting university. And I'm sure that, as you said, you really can help to chart the new course. And anything I can do, I'm going to watch, of course, with the avid interest, but I hope I can play a little bit alongside you as you do that, because it will be very, very stimulating and great fun, and I think very productive. So congratulations to all of you, and thank you for having me.